A millionaire spends everything to save his mother, but discovers the diagnosis might be wrong. A dedicated nurse reveals inconsistencies at the hospital and warns him about a possible scam. He starts an investigation and faces financial pressures and moral dilemmas. Now he must choose between exposing the corruption or protecting his mother's health. The rising sun bathed the skyscrapers of New York in a golden glow, reflecting off the mirrored windows of the imposing headquarters of Thompson Enterprises. On the 50th floor, Ethan Thompson, a 45-year-old man with graying temples and sharp eyes, gazed at the city he had helped shape over the past 20 years. His empire, built with iron determination and bold decisions, spanned various sectors: technology, construction, and agribusiness. Ethan adjusted his silk tie, a gift from his mother, Margaret Thompson, on his last birthday. He thought of her with an affectionate smile. Despite all the success and wealth he had accumulated, it was his mother's unconditional love that kept him grounded, reminding him of his humble origins and the values that had guided him to where he was. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he said, turning to find his assistant, Linda Carter, an efficient middle-aged woman. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson. The meeting with the investors is scheduled for 10 a.m., and Mr. Johnson from the construction company called to confirm today's lunch." Ethan nodded, his mind already calculating the next moves. "Thank you, Linda. Please prepare the quarterly report for the meeting," and his phone vibrated, cutting him off. His mother's name flashed on the screen, unusual for this time of day. "One moment, Linda," he said, answering the call. "Mom, is everything okay?" The voice on the other end was weak, trembling. "Ethan, my son, I'm not feeling well. I think I need to see a doctor." Ethan's heart raced. His mother, always so strong and independent, rarely admitted weakness. "Don't worry, Mom, I'm on my way. Stay calm. I'll take you to the best hospital in the city." Hanging up the phone, he turned to Linda, who was watching him with concern. "Cancel all my appointments for today. My mother isn't well. I need to take her to the hospital." "Of course, sir. I hope Mrs. Thompson feels better soon. Should I call the driver?" "No, I'll drive myself, thank you, Linda." Ethan grabbed his jacket and hurried out of the office, his mind a whirlwind of worry. As he descended in the private elevator, he remembered how his mother had always been by his side, even during the tough times when they lived in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of New York. Margaret, widowed since Ethan was a child, had worked tirelessly as a seamstress to ensure her son had access to the best education possible. Those were years of sacrifice, sleepless nights, and postponed dreams. But she never complained, always wearing a smile and offering words of encouragement to her son. As he left the building, Ethan waved to the security guard and headed to his sports car. Within minutes, he was navigating the congested streets of New York, his mind torn between concern for his mother and the memories flooding back. He remembered the day he turned 18 and won a scholarship to study business administration at one of the country's top universities. Margaret cried tears of joy, hugging him tightly. "You're going to go far, my son," she said. "Never forget where you came from, and always help those in need." Those words echoed in his mind as he maneuvered the car through the familiar streets of his old neighborhood. Despite his insistence that his mother move to a luxury apartment, Margaret preferred to stay in the modest house where Ethan had grown up. "This is where my roots are, my son," she always said. "And yours too." When he arrived, he found Mrs. Margaret sitting on the porch, pale and visibly shaken. His heart tightened at the sight of the woman who had always been his safe haven, now appearing so fragile. "Mom," he called softly, approaching her. "I'm here. Let's go to the hospital, okay?" Margaret smiled weakly, reaching out her hand to her son. "Oh, Ethan, I didn't want to bother you. You must be so busy." "You're never a bother, Mom," he replied, helping her to her feet. "You've always been my priority." On the way to the hospital, Ethan couldn't help but notice how his mother seemed to have aged suddenly. Her hair, once a vibrant brown with a few silver strands, now appeared more gray. Her hands, which he remembered as strong and nimble, while handling fabrics and needles, now trembled slightly. At New York General Hospital, the most prestigious in the city, Ethan used all his influence to ensure immediate care. While they waited for the test results, he held his mother's hand, trying to convey confidence. "Everything will be fine, Mom. We're in the best place possible." Margaret smiled, squeezing her son's hand. "I know, my dear. You've always taken such good care of me. I'm proud of the man you've become." Those words touched Ethan deeply. Despite all his business success, nothing compared to his mother's approval. The hours passed slowly. Ethan alternated between staying by his mother's side and making calls, rearranging his schedule and staying updated on business matters. During a moment of pause, he observed the hospital's activity: hurried doctors, attentive nurses, anxious families. Everything there reminded them of the fragility of life and how, despite all their wealth and power, there were things money couldn't control. Finally, Dr. Michael Harris, a renowned specialist, entered the room. His serious expression made Ethan straighten up, bracing himself for what was to come. "Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Margaret Thompson," the doctor began, "the test results are in. Unfortunately, it's not the news we were hoping for." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. "What is it, doctor? Please be direct." Dr. Harris hesitated for a moment, glancing from Ethan to Margaret. "Well, we've identified a rare and complex condition. It's an autoimmune disease that is affecting several of Mrs. Thompson's organs. The prognosis, without proper treatment, is not favorable." Margaret squeezed Ethan's hand and he suddenly felt weak. "And what's the treatment, doctor?" he asked, his voice betraying his anxiety. "There is an experimental treatment," Dr. Harris explained. "It's an innovative therapy that has shown promising results in similar cases. However, I must warn you, it's an expensive procedure and not yet covered by insurance." Ethan didn't hesitate. "Cost is not an issue, doctor. I want the best possible treatment for my mother. What do we need to do?" The doctor nodded, seemingly relieved. "I'll prepare all the paperwork and explain the next steps. But I must emphasize, this is a difficult path. The treatment is intensive and will take a lot out of Mrs. Thompson." As the doctor left to gather more information, Ethan turned to his mother. Margaret looked at him with a mix of love and concern. "Son, I don't want you to worry so much. I've already lived a good life thanks to you." Ethan felt tears forming in his eyes. "Don't talk like that, Mom. We'll fight this together, like we always have. I promise I'll do everything in my power to make sure you get better." At that moment, looking at his mother's tired but determined face, Ethan made a silent promise. He would move heaven and earth, spend every penny of his fortune if necessary, to save the life of the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. As the sun set outside, painting the New York sky with shades of orange and pink, Ethan Thompson prepared for the most important battle of his life. A battle that would test not only his financial resources, but also his emotional strength and the values his mother had taught him since childhood. The empire he had built now seemed small in the face of the challenge before him. But Ethan was determined. For his mother, he would face any obstacle, make any sacrifice. The journey that began that night would not only change Margaret's fate, but also the course of Ethan's life and everyone around him. The days following the revelation of Margaret's diagnosis were a whirlwind for Ethan Thompson. The businessman, accustomed to leading million-dollar negotiations and making decisions that affected thousands of lives, now found himself facing a challenge that left him more vulnerable than ever before. New York General Hospital became practically his second home. Between rushed video conference meetings and constant calls to his executives, Ethan spent every free moment by his mother's side. Margaret, in turn, faced the situation with a serenity that both inspired and worried her son. "Mom, you need to fight," Ethan insisted, holding her hand as he watched the doctors adjust the monitoring equipment. Margaret smiled, her tired eyes still full of love. "I'm fighting, my son, but I am also at peace. You've given me a wonderful life." Those words, far from comforting Ethan, only strengthened his resolve. He couldn't accept the idea of losing his mother, not when there was still a chance to save her. It was on a particularly tense afternoon that Dr. Michael Harris called Ethan for a private conversation. The doctor, usually composed, seemed nervous as he led the businessman to his office. "Mr. Thompson," he began as soon as the door was closed, "we need to discuss the experimental treatment for your mother." Ethan straightened in his chair, all his senses on alert. "Go ahead, doctor. I'm ready for whatever it takes." Dr. Harris hesitated for a moment before continuing. "The treatment I mentioned is truly our best hope for Margaret. It's an innovative therapy that combines cutting-edge medications with a highly specialized procedure." "And what's the issue, doctor?" Ethan asked, sensing there was more to come. "The cost, Mr. Thompson. The treatment is, well, extraordinarily expensive. We're talking about figures that exceed what most of our patients could even consider." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Doctor, I've made it clear that cost is not an issue. How much are we talking about exactly?" The doctor handed Ethan a piece of paper, which he took with steady hands. Upon seeing the number, even he, accustomed to dealing with large sums, felt a shock. "This is substantial," Ethan murmured, more to himself than to the doctor. "I understand if you need time to think, Mr. Thompson. It's a very serious decision and—" "There's nothing to think about," Ethan interrupted, his voice regaining its firmness. "If this treatment can save my mother, then that's what we'll do. Prepare everything that's necessary." Dr. Harris seemed simultaneously relieved and concerned. "I understand your decision, Mr. Thompson, but I must warn you, even with all this investment, there are no absolute guarantees. The treatment is experimental for a reason." Ethan stood up, his gaze determined. "Doctor, I've spent my entire life calculating risks and making bets. This is the most important bet I've ever made, and I'm willing to risk everything for my mother." As he left the doctor's office, Ethan felt the weight of the decision he had just made. The cost of the treatment was astronomical, even for someone with his fortune. Going through with it would mean selling assets, liquidating investments, perhaps even jeopardizing parts of his business empire. As he walked through the hospital corridors, his mind worked furiously. He would need to act quickly, mobilize his financial team, make bold moves in the market. But one thing was certain. Nothing would be more important than saving Margaret's life. Back in his mother's room, Ethan was met with a scene that took him by surprise. Margaret was sitting on the bed, laughing softly as she chatted with a young nurse. The professional, with her brown hair tied in a messy bun and bright green eyes, seemed to have brought a bit of light to the gloomy hospital environment. "Ah, Ethan," Margaret exclaimed upon seeing him. "Come meet Sophia, she's been an angel to me." The nurse turned, a warm smile on her face. "Mr. Thompson, it's a pleasure to finally meet you. Your mother speaks very highly of you." Ethan, momentarily disconcerted by the unexpectedly cheerful scene, extended his hand. "The pleasure is mine, Sophia. Thank you for taking such good care of my mother." "It's the least I can do," Sophia replied, her voice soft but firm. "Mrs. Margaret is a wonderful patient." There was something in the way Sophia spoke, a genuine sincerity and compassion that touched Ethan. Amid all the clinical coldness and discussions about costs and treatments, here was someone who seemed to see his mother as a person, not just a patient. "Sophia has been telling me fascinating stories about the hospital, son," Margaret commented, her eyes shining with an enthusiasm Ethan hadn't seen in days. "Did you know she's studying to become a doctor?" "It's true," Sophia confirmed, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "I work here to pay for my studies. I still have a few years left, but every day is a new lesson." Ethan observed the interaction between his mother and the young nurse, noticing how Margaret seemed more animated and alert. It was a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere that usually hung over the room. "Well, I'm glad my mother is in such good hands," Ethan said, feeling a wave of gratitude. "Sophia, if there's anything I can do to help with your studies or—" Sophia raised a hand, gently interrupting him. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Thompson, but it's not necessary. Taking care of patients like Mrs. Margaret is reward enough." At that moment, Ethan's phone buzzed insistently in his pocket. He pulled it out, seeing a series of urgent messages from his finance team. "If you'll excuse me," he said, heading toward the door, "I need to make some calls." In the hallway, Ethan answered the call from his financial director, Daniel. "Ethan, we have a problem," Daniel's tense voice echoed through the phone. "The Securities and Exchange Commission is investigating one of our major holdings. They've temporarily frozen a significant portion of our assets." Ethan's blood ran cold. "What? How is that possible? Our operations have always been transparent." Apparently, there are suspicions of irregularities in some recent transactions. We're gathering all the documentation to prove our innocence. But for now, a considerable portion of our capital is inaccessible. Ethan felt the world spinning around him. The timing couldn't be worse. Just when he needed to mobilize all possible resources for his mother's treatment, a significant part of his fortune was out of reach. Daniel, I need you to gather the legal team immediately. We'll resolve this as quickly as possible, and in the meantime start exploring all our options for immediate liquidity. Hanging up the phone, Ethan leaned against the hallway wall, closing his eyes for a moment. The magnitude of the challenge he faced was beginning to reveal itself. On one side, the experimental treatment that could save his mother with an astronomical cost. On the other, an investigation that threatened to freeze a significant portion of his resources. Taking a deep breath, he composed himself. He couldn't let his mother or anyone at the hospital notice his concern. Returning to the room, he found Margaret now alone, Sophia having left to attend to other patients. "Is everything all right, son?" Margaret asked, noticing the tension on Ethan's face. He forced a smile, sitting down beside the bed. "Of course. Mom, just some work issues to sort out, nothing to worry about." Margaret reached out, touching her son's face tenderly. "Ethan, I know you better than anyone. I can tell when something's bothering you. I don't want you to sacrifice everything for my sake." "Mom," Ethan replied, holding her hand, "you've always sacrificed everything for me. Now it's my turn to give back. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you're okay." As the sun set outside, casting golden shadows across the hospital room, Ethan Thompson faced the greatest dilemma of his life. How could he balance his unconditional love for his mother with the brutal realities of the business world? How could he save her life without destroying everything he had built? Sophia's words echoed in his mind. Caring for patients like Mrs. Thompson is reward enough. There was a purity in that statement that starkly contrasted with the cold, calculated world of business he was accustomed to. Looking at his mother, who now slept peacefully, Ethan made a silent promise. He would find a way. No matter the cost, no matter the obstacles. He would save his mother and, in the process, perhaps rediscover the core values she had always taught him. The path ahead would be difficult, full of twists and unexpected challenges. But Ethan Thompson was ready to face them one by one, with the same determination that had taken him to the top of the business world. The battle for Margaret's life was just beginning, and he had no intention of losing. The dawn in New York found Ethan Thompson already awake, his tired eyes fixed on the screen of his laptop. He had spent the night wide awake, analyzing financial reports and exchanging frantic emails with his legal team. The SEC investigation into his holdings was just the tip of the iceberg. The more he dug, the more complicated the situation seemed. A soft knock on the door of the hospital room where he had spent the night pulled him from his thoughts. It was Sophia, the nurse, bringing breakfast for Mrs. Thompson. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," she greeted, her voice low so as not to disturb Margaret, who was still asleep. "Did you stay here all night?" Ethan nodded, rubbing his eyes. "Yes, I had a lot of work to do and I didn't want to leave my mother alone." Sophia watched him for a moment, a look of concern on her face. "You know, taking care of yourself is just as important as taking care of her. Mrs. Thompson will need you to be strong." There was something in the direct yet gentle way Sophia spoke that touched Ethan. She wasn't like the flattering executives or the distant doctors he was used to. "Thank you, Sophia. I'll try to remember that," he replied, a faint smile on his lips. At that moment, Margaret began to wake up. Her eyes opened slowly, focusing first on Sophia and then on her son. "Ethan, did you stay here all night?" she asked, her voice still hoarse from sleep. "Don't worry, Mom, I was just catching up on some work," he replied, moving closer to the bed. Sophia discreetly began organizing Margaret's breakfast. "Mrs. Thompson, I brought some chamomile tea and toast. Dr. Harris said we can start introducing more solid foods today." As he helped Margaret sit up, Ethan couldn't help but notice the skill and care with which Sophia carried out her tasks. There was an efficiency in her movements that went beyond mere professionalism. It was as if she truly cared. "Sophia, dear," Margaret called, holding the nurse's hand. "You've been an angel to us. How can I ever thank you?" Sophia smiled, her eyes shining. "Mrs. Thompson, taking care of you is a pleasure. I just want to see you getting better every day." Ethan watched the interaction, an idea forming in his mind. He needed allies within the hospital, people he could trust to keep his mother safe and comfortable. Sophia seemed to be exactly the kind of person he needed. "Sophia," he called, as the nurse was about to leave the room. "Could I have a moment?" They moved to a corner of the room, away from Margaret's hearing. "I know this might seem inappropriate," Ethan began, his voice low, "but I'd like to ask for a special favor. My mother trusts you, and I'm starting to trust you too. Could you keep an eye on her when I'm not around? Report anything unusual, any changes in her treatment?" Sophia looked at him, a mix of surprise and hesitation on her face. "Mr. Thompson, I always take care of all my patients with the utmost attention." I know, Ethan interrupted gently. "But this is different. There are complications I can't explain right now. I just need to know that someone here is truly on our side." There was a moment of silence as Sophia seemed to ponder the request. Finally, she nodded. "All right, Mr. Thompson. I'll do what I can to keep Mrs. Thompson safe and comfortable, but I want to make it clear that I won't do anything unethical or illegal." "I would never ask that," Ethan replied, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. "Thank you, Sophia. This means a lot to me." As soon as Sophia left the room, Ethan's phone vibrated. It was Daniel, his CFO. "Boss, we have news about the SEC investigation." Daniel's tense voice echoed through the phone. "It seems someone inside leaked information about our recent transactions. We're dealing with a possible betrayal." Ethan's blood ran cold. An internal betrayal was the last thing he needed right now. "Daniel, gather the security team. I want a full sweep of all our systems, and schedule an emergency board meeting for this afternoon. I'll be there." Hanging up the phone, Ethan turned his attention to Margaret, who was watching him with concern. "Is everything all right, son?" she asked. Ethan forced a smile. "Of course, Mom. Just some company matters to sort out. Nothing to worry about." But internally, his mind was racing. The situation was quickly becoming more complicated. With part of his assets frozen, and now the threat of an internal betrayal, the challenge of funding his mother's treatment was becoming increasingly monumental. Hours later, in the grand meeting hall of Thompson Enterprises, Ethan faced his board of directors. The expressions around the table ranged from concern to outright hostility. "Gentlemen," Ethan began, his voice steady despite his exhaustion, "we are facing an unprecedented crisis. The SEC investigation is just the beginning. We have reason to believe there is a traitor among us." A murmur swept through the room. Robert Johnson, one of the longest-serving board members, stood up. "Ethan, with all due respect, this isn't the only crisis we're dealing with. We've learned that you are considering liquidating significant company assets for a personal matter." Ethan felt his face flush. How had they found out about his mother's treatment? "My personal affairs are none of the board's concern, as long as they don't affect the company's performance," he replied, trying to remain calm. "But they are affecting it," exclaimed another board member, Emily Davis. "You're distracted, making rash decisions, and now this investigation. Ethan, perhaps it's time to consider a temporary leave." The suggestion landed like a bomb in the room. Ethan looked around, searching for allies, but found only expressions of doubt and concern. "This is absurd," he finally said, his voice trembling slightly with anger. "I built this company from the ground up. We've faced crises before and always come out stronger. I won't abandon the helm now." Daniel, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke. "Ethan, no one is suggesting a permanent departure, but perhaps stepping back to deal with your personal matters would be best for everyone." Ethan stared at his CFO, a man he considered a close friend. Daniel's suggestion hurt more than all the others. "You don't understand," Ethan said, his voice now almost a whisper. "I can't step away now, there's too much at stake." Robert Johnson stepped closer, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "We know about your mother, Ethan, and we understand your concern, but you need to understand ours. This company affects the lives of thousands of employees and their families. We can't risk everything for one person, no matter how important they are to you." Robert's words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He looked around the room, at the faces staring back at him with a mix of sympathy and resolve. He realized he was alone in this fight. "Very well," he finally said, his voice heavy with emotion. "You will have my decision by the end of the week, but know that I will not easily give up what I have built." Leaving the meeting room, Ethan felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. On one side, the battle for his mother's life. On the other, the fight to maintain control of his empire. And in the midst of it all, the shadow of betrayal looming over his head. As he walked through the corridors of his building, an idea began to form in his mind. If there was a traitor in the company, perhaps he could use it to his advantage. A risky move, certainly, but Ethan Thompson hadn't gotten where he was by playing it safe. With determined steps, he headed to his office. He had calls to make, plans to draw up. The battle was just beginning, and he had no intention of losing on any front. The sun was setting over New York, casting long shadows across the skyscrapers. At the hospital, Margaret slept peacefully, unaware of the storms brewing around her, and in his office, Ethan Thompson prepared for the greatest challenge of his life, determined to save both his mother and his legacy, no matter the cost. Ethan's office at the top of the Thompson Enterprises building was bathed in the dim light of dusk. The businessman, seated in his leather chair, absent-mindedly twirled a pen between his fingers, his gaze fixed on the city stretching out below. The lights of New York were beginning to flicker on, creating a carpet of urban stars that contrasted with the darkening sky. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he said, his voice tired but firm. Linda, his longtime assistant, entered quietly. "Mr. Thompson, I brought the reports you asked for, and there's one more thing." Ethan raised an eyebrow, noticing the hesitation in her voice. "What is it, Linda?" She approached, placing a folder on the desk. "I found something unusual while reviewing the recent financial records. There are a series of transfers to an account I couldn't fully trace, all approved by someone in upper management, but you don't know who," Ethan finished, picking up the folder. His heart raced. Could this be the clue he was looking for? "Thank you, Linda. You did well to bring this directly to me. Please don't mention it to anyone else." Once alone again, Ethan dove into the documents. The transfers were subtle, skillfully camouflaged, but to trained eyes like his, they formed a clear pattern. Someone was embezzling funds, and it wasn't an amateur. Your phone rang, interrupting your analysis. It was Dr. Harris. "Mr. Thompson, we have good news. The first results of your mother's tests have come in, and there are promising signs. I believe we can start the experimental treatment sooner than expected." Ethan felt a mix of relief and anxiety. "That's great, Doctor. When can we begin?" "Well, that's the thing." The doctor hesitated. "To start the treatment, we'll need the first payment by the end of this week." The businessman closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the situation. "I understand. I'll do what's necessary, Doctor. My mother will have the best treatment possible." Hanging up the phone, Ethan turned his attention back to the documents on his desk. Time was running out and he needed to act quickly. The next morning, Ethan called an urgent meeting with his closest team: Daniel, the CFO, Robert Johnson, and Emily Davis from the board, and a few other trusted executives gathered in the conference room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan began, his voice heavy with gravity, "we've uncovered evidence of irregular financial activities within the company. Someone is embezzling funds, and I believe this person may also be behind the leak of information to the SEC. A tense silence fell over the room. Daniel was the first to speak. "Ethan, that's a serious accusation. Are you sure?" "Absolutely," Ethan replied, sliding copies of the reports across the table. "I want a full internal investigation. No one is above suspicion." Emily Davis frowned. "Including you, Ethan? After all, we know you're facing significant personal expenses." The look Ethan gave Emily could have frozen hell. "Especially me, Emily. My personal life is open for scrutiny. I have nothing to hide." As the meeting continued with heated discussions about how to proceed, Ethan carefully observed the reactions of everyone in the room. Who seemed nervous? Who was being defensive? And more importantly, who remained suspiciously calm? After hours of debate, a plan was set. An external audit team would be hired, all financial records would be reviewed, and additional security measures would be implemented across all company systems. Leaving the meeting, Ethan was approached by Robert Johnson. The older advisor seemed concerned. "Ethan, can I have a word in private?" They headed to an empty room. Robert closed the door and turned to Ethan, his expression serious. "My boy, I'm worried about you. This witch hunt. Are you sure it's the best path? You're putting a lot of pressure on yourself and the company at an already delicate time." Ethan studied the face of the man who had mentored his father years ago. "Robert, I appreciate your concern, but I can't let anyone sabotage everything we've built, and I definitely can't let it interfere with my mother's treatment." Robert sighed, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I understand, my boy. I just fear you're playing a dangerous game. Remember, not all your enemies are outside the company. Be careful." Robert's words echoed in Ethan's mind as he headed to the hospital to visit his mother. Entering the room, he found Margaret sitting on the bed, chatting animatedly with Sophia. "Oh, son," Margaret exclaimed, her face lighting up. "I'm so glad you came. Sophia was telling me about the new treatments being developed. It's fascinating." Ethan smiled, feeling some of the tension leave his body. Seeing his mother so lively was a balm to his troubled soul. "I'm happy to see you so well, Mom," he said, sitting beside her. Turning to Sophia, he added, "Thank you for keeping her spirits up." Sophia smiled, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "It's a pleasure, Mr. Thompson. Your mother is an inspiration to all of us here." As Sophia stepped out to give the family privacy, Ethan noticed something in her gaze, a mix of admiration and concern. "Son," Margaret's voice brought him back to the present moment. "You look tired. Is everything okay at the company?" Ethan hesitated. His mother had always been perceptive, able to read his emotions like an open book. "Just a few challenges, Mom, nothing to worry about." Margaret took her son's hand, her piercing eyes fixed on his. "Ethan, I know you. I can tell when something is bothering you. Don't sacrifice your integrity or the company for my sake. Promise, you won't do anything you'll regret later." His mother's words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. How could she see through him so easily? "Mom, At that moment, Dr. Harris entered the room, interrupting the intimate moment. "Sorry to intrude. Mr. Thompson, could I speak with you for a moment?" In the hallway, the doctor seemed nervous. "Mr. Thompson, I received an interesting call today. Someone offered a considerable sum to delay your mother's treatment." Ethan felt his blood run cold. "What? Who would do that?" The doctor shook his head. "I don't know. The offer was made anonymously. Of course, I refused immediately, but I thought you should know." Thanking the doctor, Ethan returned to his mother's room, his mind racing. The situation was escalating quickly. It wasn't enough that someone was sabotaging his company. Now they were actively trying to prevent Margaret's treatment. Looking at his mother, who now slept peacefully, Ethan felt a fierce determination growing within him. He would find the person responsible, no matter the cost. He would protect his mother and his legacy, even if it meant playing dirty. Quietly, stepping out of the room, Ethan made a call. "Daniel, I need you to do something for me. It's risky and not entirely legal, but necessary. Are you willing to help me?" Daniel's response was immediate and firm. "Always, boss. What do you need?" As he explained his plan, Ethan looked out the hospital window at the city beyond. New York, with its lights and shadows, seemed to reflect the battle raging in his heart. Light and darkness, right and wrong, loyalty and betrayal. He was about to cross a line from which he might not be able to return. But with his mother's life and the future of his company at stake, Ethan Thompson was prepared to do whatever it took. The power game had begun, and he was determined to win, no matter the cost. Night fell over New York as Sophia left the hospital, her hurried footsteps echoing in the nearly empty parking lot. Her thoughts were far away, divided between concerns for her patients and her own personal dilemmas. She didn't notice she was being followed. A dark car kept its distance, its low beams almost imperceptible in the dim light. Inside, Daniel, Ethan's CFO, watched every move the young nurse made. Ethan's instructions had been clear. Find out everything he could about Sophia. Something about her intrigued him, a detail that didn't quite fit the story she told. Sophia entered a small apartment in Brooklyn, an old 3-story building. Daniel noted the address, patiently waiting until the lights in her apartment turned on. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Ethan kept watch over his mother's sleep. Margaret seemed more fragile with each passing day, but she still had that sparkle in her eyes that had always defined her. "Son," she murmured as she woke, startling Ethan. "I need to talk to you about something important." Ethan moved closer, holding his mother's hand. "I'm here, Mom. What do you want to tell me?" Margaret took a deep breath, her eyes gaining an intensity that contrasted with her apparent fragility. "There's a secret I've carried for many years, a secret that could change everything you know about our family." Margaret's words hung in the air, heavy with a weight Ethan had never imagined existed. "What are you talking about, Mom?" he asked, feeling a chill run down his spine. Before Margaret could answer, Dr. Harris entered the room. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, "but we need to run some tests now." The moment of revelation was cut short, leaving Ethan in an almost unbearable state of anxiety. What secret was his mother keeping? The next morning, Daniel was waiting for him in his office, a discreet envelope in hand. "I found something interesting about Sophia," he said, handing the documents to Ethan. The papers revealed a complex story. Sophia wasn't just a nursing student. Her background showed surprising connections to important figures in the medical and business worlds. "Look here," Daniel pointed to a photo. "She has a family tie to one of the biggest investors in New York's healthcare sector." Ethan furrowed his brow, carefully analyzing the documents. Something didn't quite add up. Why would a nurse with such connections work in a hospital, dealing directly with patients? His phone vibrated. It was Sophia. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice tense, "I need to speak with you, something important about your mother's treatment." Before Ethan could respond, the call was cut off. At the hospital, the tension was palpable. Dr. Harris seemed nervous, avoiding direct contact with Ethan. Margaret's test results were contradictory, sometimes encouraging, sometimes concerning. Sophia found him in the hallway, her face pale, her eyes filled with an urgency Ethan had never seen before. "We need to talk in private," she said, pulling him into an empty room. "What's going on?" Ethan asked. Sophia took a deep breath. "Your mother's treatment. It's not what it seems. There's something much bigger behind all of this." At that moment, Ethan felt he was about to uncover something that would change everything. Sophia's revelation would be the start of a plot involving family secrets, corporate interests, and a conspiracy that went far beyond what Ethan could imagine. Meanwhile, at the Thompson Enterprises office, Robert Johnson received a mysterious call. His expression was one of concern, almost fear. "Understood," he murmured into the phone. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect the company, and to protect you." Who was he referring to? What did he know? At the hospital, Margaret seemed to be fighting something more than just her physical condition. There was a secret in her eyes, an untold story that weighed heavily on her shoulders. Ethan looked at Sophia, waiting for the revelation that would change everything. What would she say? What secrets were about to be exposed? The truth was about to come to light, and nothing would ever be the same. The room was engulfed in a heavy silence, broken only by Sophia's labored breathing. Ethan watched her, sensing that every word she spoke could completely alter the course of his life. "Spit it out," he said, his voice a mix of impatience and apprehension. Sophia hesitated for a moment, her green eyes scanning the room as if afraid of being overheard. "The treatment for your mother. It's not what it seems. There's a complex web of interests behind it all." Ethan felt a chill. "What kind of interests?" "Medical research groups," Sophia began, her voice low. "They're using patients as test subjects for experimental treatments. Your mother isn't just a patient. She's part of something much bigger." Sophia's words felt like an incomprehensible puzzle. Ethan needed more details. "Explain yourself better," he demanded. Sophia took a deep breath. Her story was about to be revealed, but she knew every word could put her at risk. "My father," she started, "was a prominent scientist in the field of medical research. He was working on a secret project involving experimental treatments for rare diseases. Before he disappeared, he left me some documents." Ethan frowned. Disappeared. He was removed from the project after discovering something he wasn't supposed to, Sophia continued. Something related to experiments that crossed the ethical boundaries of medical research. At that moment, Ethan's phone vibrated. It was Daniel. "Boss, I found something strange in the hospital records. There are financial transfers to offshore accounts that we can't fully trace." Sophia, who had overheard part of the conversation, seemed even more nervous. "Those transfers, they're related to the experimental treatment." Ethan felt the world spinning. His mother was at the center of something far more complex than a simple medical treatment. "We need proof," he said. "Documents, something concrete." Sophia hesitated. "I have some files that my father hid, but revealing this could put us in danger." As they spoke, they didn't notice they were being watched. Robert Johnson, discreetly positioned in the hallway, noted every move. In the offices of Thompson Enterprises, Daniel continued his investigation. The documents he had found suggested a web of connections between hospitals, research groups, and international investors. "This goes far beyond a simple treatment," he murmured to himself. Back at the hospital, Margaret woke from a restless sleep. Her eyes, once tired, seemed to have regained a special sparkle, as if she knew something no one else did. "Ethan," she called, her voice firm, "I need you to pay attention to what I'm about to say." He approached, holding his mother's hand. "I'm here, Mom. What do you want to tell me?" Margaret looked around as if afraid of being overheard. "There are secrets in our family that you need to know. Secrets that could explain a lot about who we are." Sophia, who was nearby, felt her heart race. What would Margaret reveal? "Before your father died," Margaret continued, "he told me something. A secret I've kept for years to protect you." Ethan felt each word like a blow. What secrets had his family been hiding? Outside the room, Robert Johnson watched the scene, his phone discreetly in hand. Who was he messaging? The tension in the room was palpable. Each person there held a piece of a larger puzzle. Sophia, with the secrets of her scientist father. Ethan, with his determination to save his mother. Margaret, with revelations that could change everything. And at the center of it all, the experimental treatment that seemed to hide much more than a simple attempt at a cure. The truth was about to be revealed. But at what cost? Ethan looked at his mother, at Sophia, feeling he was on the brink of a discovery that would completely change his life. What would Margaret reveal? What secrets were about to come to light? The answer was close, but the path to discovering it would be filled with traps and surprising revelations. The silence in the hospital room was deafening. Ethan felt every beat of his heart like a drum, marking the rhythm of anticipation. His mother, Margaret, seemed to be fighting something more than her physical condition. There was an internal battle, a conflict of emotions that was evident in her eyes. "Son," Margaret began, her voice trembling, "what I'm about to tell you will change everything you know about our family." Sophia, who remained discreetly in the corner of the room, felt a shiver run down her spine. "Something tells me this revelation is going to connect us in ways we can't even imagine," she thought. Margaret took a deep breath. "Your father wasn't who you always believed him to be." Ethan furrowed his brow. "What do you mean, Mom?" "The man you knew as your biological father," she continued, "wasn't your real father. He was a good man who loved and supported me, but he wasn't your blood father." The words fell like bombs, making the ground feel unstable beneath Ethan's feet. "Who is my real father then?" he asked, his voice controlled by a superhuman effort. Margaret looked at Sophia, as if silently asking for permission. The nurse, equally surprised, simply nodded slightly. "Your real father," Margaret revealed, "was a scientist, a brilliant man who worked on a revolutionary medical research project. a project that could completely change the way we treat genetic diseases. Sophia took a step forward, her face suddenly pale. "My father," she murmured. To herself, Ethan looked at Sophia, a sudden understanding dawning in his eyes. You know something about this, don't you?" Before Sophia could respond, Ethan's phone vibrated. It was Daniel, his financial director. "Boss, I found something you need to see immediately." Daniel's voice sounded tense. "There's a connection between the hospital's investments and a series of biotech companies, and something tells me it's not a coincidence." Ethan excused himself from Margaret and Sophia, stepping out of the room to take the call. In the hallway, his mind buzzed with the revelations. "Send everything to my email," he instructed. "I need to analyze it personally." When he returned, he found Sophia whispering quietly with Margaret. They stopped abruptly when they saw him. "What were you talking about?" Ethan asked, his suspicion growing. Sophia hesitated. "We were trying to understand how everything connects. My father's work, your mother's condition, the experimental treatments." At that moment, Dr. Harris entered the room. His expression was different, less clinical, more concerned. "Mr. Thompson," he said, "we need to talk about your mother's treatment. There are aspects that haven't been fully clarified." The tension in the room was palpable. Each person there held a piece of a larger puzzle, and no one seemed willing to reveal their part completely. In the offices of Thompson Enterprises, Daniel continued his investigation. The documents he had found suggested a complex web of interests that went far beyond a simple medical treatment. Robert Johnson, discreetly observing everything, made an encrypted call. "We need to act soon. Things are getting out of control." Who was he reporting to? What greater interests were at stake? Back at the hospital, Margaret held Ethan's hand. "There's more," she said, "much more, and you need to be prepared for what you're about to discover." Sophia looked at them, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. She knew her story was about to intertwine with Ethan's in a way neither of them could predict. Dr. Harris cleared his throat. "Mr. Thompson, your mother's treatment, it's not just a treatment. It's part of something much bigger." Ethan felt a chill. What secrets were yet to be revealed? What connections existed between his family, Sophia, the hospital, and the mysterious research projects? The truth was close, but would it be something Ethan was prepared to accept? The battle for Margaret's life had turned into a war for revelations that could completely change the fate of everyone involved. And at the center of it all, a secret waited to be uncovered. Ethan's office, at the top of the Thompson Enterprises skyscraper, was immersed in a dim light that reflected the complexity of the newly discovered secrets. Documents scattered across the table, Daniel by his side, both trying to decipher the puzzle that was forming. "Look at this." Daniel pointed to a series of charts and spreadsheets. "The financial transfers aren't random. There's a specific pattern linking the hospital, some biotech companies, and offshore accounts." Ethan glanced over the documents, his mind racing at full speed. "This has something to do with my mother's treatment, I'm sure of it." His phone vibrated. A message from Sophia. "We need to talk. I have important information." Meanwhile, at the hospital, Margaret was speaking with Dr. Harris. Something in her expression was different, a mix of determination and fear. "Doctor," she said, her voice steady. "The time has come, we can't delay any longer." The doctor hesitated. "Mrs. Thompson, the risks are enormous. If anyone finds out—" "They already have," she interrupted, "and now we need to protect Ethan." In Ethan's office, Daniel continued his analysis. "Look at these connections," he pointed out. "The research project involves something much bigger than just a medical treatment." Ethan felt a chill. What exactly are we uncovering? Before Daniel could respond, Ethan's phone rang. It was Robert Johnson. "We need to talk," Robert said, his voice tense. "In person, and fast." The meeting was set for a discreet location, a cafe in downtown New York, away from prying eyes. Sophia, meanwhile, was preparing her own documents, papers she had kept for years, secrets from her scientist father, information that could change everything. At the cafe, Robert waited for Ethan. His expression was one of deep concern. "What's going on?" Ethan asked as soon as he sat down. Robert took a deep breath. "Your mother's treatment. It's not what it seems. There's a research project that goes far beyond just an experimental therapy." Ethan felt the world spin. "Explain." "Your real father," Robert began, "was part of a group of scientists working on a groundbreaking project. A project that could completely change the understanding of genetic diseases." At that moment, Sophia walked into the cafe. Her presence seemed to freeze time. "Don't say anything more," she said to Robert. "Not without me." Ethan looked from Sophia to Robert, sensing that he was about to discover something that would change his life forever. Sophia placed a folder on the table. Documents, charts, research reports. Each paper seemed to hold a piece of a larger secret. "Your father," she said to Ethan, "was developing a gene therapy that could cure diseases considered incurable. But there were powerful interests that wanted to stop the project," Robert confirmed with a discreet nod. "Pharmaceutical groups, investors, people who profit from prolonged treatments, not definitive cures." Ethan felt a growing anger. "Are you saying my father was silenced for discovering something that could help millions?" Sophia nodded. "And now your mother's treatment seems to be part of a bigger plan, a way to continue the work your father started." Ethan's phone vibrated. It was the hospital. An urgent message from Margaret. "Son, I need you to come immediately. The truth can't wait any longer." As he left the cafe, Ethan felt the weight of an impending revelation. What secrets was his mother keeping? What connections existed between his family, Sophia, and this mysterious research project? The truth was close, but would it be something Ethan was prepared to accept? The battle for Margaret's life had turned into a war for revelations that could completely change the fate of everyone involved. And at the center of it all, a secret waited to be uncovered. The hospital seemed different that night. Empty hallways, a heavy silence that anticipated something important. Ethan hurried through the corridors, his heart racing. When he reached his mother's room, he found Margaret sitting on the bed, stronger than in recent days. Beside her, Dr. Harris and Sophia exchanged meaningful glances. "Son," Margaret called, "the moment of truth has come." Sophia Miller held a yellowed folder, her fingers trembling slightly. "These are the original documents from your father's research project," she explained. "Documents he hid for years to protect his discovery." Dr. Harris cleared his throat. "Your father's project was revolutionary. A gene therapy capable of reprogramming diseased cells, potentially curing illnesses we once considered untreatable." Ethan Thompson looked at his mother. "Why did you never tell me any of this?" Margaret Thompson held his hand. "To protect you. There were powerful people interested in stopping your father's work. Pharmaceutical groups that stood to profit more from prolonged treatments than from definitive cures." Sophia opened the folder, revealing a series of scientific documents. Complex charts, handwritten notes, research results that seemed to have been kept secret for decades. "Your father," she explained, "discovered a way to genetically modify diseased cells, restoring their original function. It was something so revolutionary that it could completely change modern medicine." Ethan felt a whirlwind of emotions: anger, surprise, admiration for the father he had never fully known. His phone vibrated. It was Daniel Wilson, his financial director. "Boss, I found something. The financial transfers from the hospital are connected to an international investment group. It seems someone is trying to buy silence about this project," Dr. Harris confirmed with a discreet nod. "Your father was threatened. Powerful groups wanted to stop his research at any cost." Margaret added, "He made me promise to protect the research, that one day you would continue it." Sophia then revealed the final detail. "Mrs. Thompson's treatment isn't just a treatment. It's a continuation of the original project, a way to validate the research your father developed." Ethan felt the world spinning. Everything he thought he knew about his family, his history, was being rewritten in that moment. "How can I continue my father's work?" he asked. Sophia smiled. "With the documents I have and Dr. Harris's expertise, we can resume the research. But it will be dangerous. Powerful people will do anything to stop us." Robert Johnson, who had discreetly arrived at the hospital, confirmed, "There have already been attempts to silence the project. Your father was just the first." Ethan looked At the documents, at his mother, at Sophia, an important decision needed to be made. "I will continue my father's work," he declared, "no matter the cost." At that moment, a nurse hurriedly entered the room. "Doctor," she said to Dr. Harris, "something's wrong with Mrs. Margaret Thompson's monitoring equipment." The machine measuring Margaret's vital signs began beeping erratically. Something was happening. What was this interruption? Another attempt to prevent the truth from being revealed. The battle for Margaret's life and the continuation of the scientific project was just beginning. And Ethan was determined to win, no matter the cost. The alarm from the monitors echoed through the hospital corridors like a warning cry. Ethan, Sophia, and Dr. Harris reacted instantly. Margaret's eyes were closed, her breathing irregular. "What's happening?" Ethan shouted, holding his mother's hand. Dr. Harris quickly checked the equipment. "It seems like external interference. With the monitors, something isn't right." Sophia examined the cables and connections. "Someone tampered with the equipment on purpose," she stated, her voice tense. Robert Johnson, who remained in the corner of the room, quickly dialed his phone. "We need security immediately. Something's wrong." Ethan felt anger rising. Who would do this? Who would try to harm my mother? Daniel, who had arrived at the hospital shortly after the call, carried a stack of documents with him. "Boss, I found something interesting in the investigations. There's a group of international investors with a direct interest in stopping the research project from continuing," Sophia confirmed. "They're pharmaceutical groups that profit from prolonged treatments. A definitive cure would mean $1 billion loss for them." Dr. Harris was preparing medications to stabilize Margaret. "We need to protect not just Mrs. Thompson, but all the documents and research she represents." Ethan looked at the documents Sophia had brought. "How can we continue my father's work without putting everyone at risk?" Robert stepped closer. "We need a strategy, something that protects the research and prevents these groups from interfering." Sophia had an idea. "We can digitize all the documents, create copies on secure servers in different countries. That way, even if they try to destroy the originals, the information will be protected." Daniel immediately started working on his laptop. "I'm already setting up digital security protocols. No one will be able to erase this information." Margaret, slowly regaining consciousness, held Ethan's hand. "Son, don't give up. Your father's work is bigger than any threat," Dr. Harris confirmed. "The preliminary results are promising. This research could revolutionize the treatment of genetic diseases." At that moment, Ethan's phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Mr. Thompson," a formal male voice said, "we have a message. Stop investigating. Stop continuing the project, or there will be consequences." Ethan looked at the others in the room. "I won't back down," he replied firmly. "This project is bigger than any threat." Sophia held his hand. "We're in this together." "You won't be alone." Robert Johnson prepared a plan. "We need to create a protection strategy. I'll reach out to my contacts in the legal and business world." Daniel Wilson continued working on his laptop. "The documents are already being copied and distributed to secure servers around the world. Even if they try to destroy something, the information will be protected." Margaret Thompson, with a faint smile, looked at her son. "I'm proud of you, Ethan. Your father would be proud to see how you're carrying on his work." Dr. Harris checked Margaret's vital signs. "She needs rest, but the results of the experimental treatment are surprisingly positive." Ethan looked around. Sophia, Robert, Daniel, the doctor, all united by a common goal: protecting the research, continuing his father's work. "We'll find a way," he declared. "No matter what happens, the truth will prevail." Night fell over New York. In the hospital, a family came together against powerful forces. A scientific, ethical, and personal battle was just beginning, and at the center of it all, the legacy of a scientist who dreamed of changing the world through science. The truth was about to be revealed, and no one could stop them. The sun rose over New York, painting the skyscrapers in golden hues. In the hospital, a complex strategy was being set into motion. Ethan gathered his makeshift team, Sophia, Daniel, Robert Johnson, and Dr. Harris, for a definitive plan. We need a move that protects the research and exposes those who truly want to silence it, Ethan declared, his gaze resolute. Daniel projected a series of spreadsheets and graphs on his laptop. My investigation has uncovered a network of investments directly connected to international pharmaceutical groups. They have a lot to lose if this research moves forward. Sophia added, "My father always said that true power lies in information. We need to make the project public before they try to destroy it completely." Dr. Harris adjusted his glasses, analyzing the documents. The scientific data is revolutionary. A gene therapy capable of reprogramming diseased cells could completely change the treatment of diseases considered incurable. Robert Johnson, more cautious, raised an important point. But we need legal protection. These groups won't hesitate to use every resource to stop us. Margaret Thompson, still lying down but with eyes shining with determination, called her son. "Ethan, remember what your father always said. The truth is the best protection." At that moment, Ethan's phone rang. It was an unexpected call from an investigative journalist who had worked with his father years ago. "Thompson," the voice said, "I have information that might interest you, but we need to meet in person. It's too risky to talk over the phone." The meeting was set for a discreet location in downtown New York. Ethan took Sophia Miller as a precaution. At the chosen cafe, the journalist, a middle-aged man named Thomas Clark, seemed nervous. His eyes constantly scanned the surroundings. "Your father's project," he began, "was much more than simple medical research. It was a threat to groups that profit from prolonged treatments." Sophia held the documents she had brought. "We have proof. We just need a strategy to make it public." Thomas then revealed a shocking detail. "There's an internal leak in one of the largest pharmaceutical groups. Someone is willing to expose the behind-the-scenes of this operation." Back at the hospital, Daniel Wilson continued his digital investigation. "I found suspicious financial transfers, offshore accounts, cross-payments. Something much bigger is going on." Robert Johnson activated his contacts in the legal world. "We need legal protection. These groups are dangerous and won't hesitate to use every resource to silence us." Dr. Harris prepared the final scientific reports. "The data is irrefutable. This research could save millions of lives." Ethan looked at his mother. Margaret smiled, holding his hand. "Continue your father's work. Don't be afraid." Sophia stepped closer. "We have a chance to change everything, to expose the truth." At that moment, Ethan's phone rang again, an encrypted message from an anonymous source. "Be careful, they're coming. The truth is about to be revealed." What did that message mean? Who were they? And what truth was about to come to light? The web of secrets was beginning to tighten. Every move could be decisive, every revelation potentially dangerous. Ethan looked around. His mother, Sophia, Daniel, Robert, Dr. Harris, all united by a common goal: to protect the truth, to continue his father's legacy. "We'll see this through," he declared, "no matter what happens." The final battle was about to begin, and no one could predict how it would unfold. The last chapter of our story began on an unusual morning. New York woke up under a thick fog, as if the city itself sensed the events about to unfold. At the hospital, Margaret seemed stronger than ever. Her eyes shone with a determination that inspired everyone around her. "The time has come," she said to Ethan, holding his hand. "The truth needs to be revealed." Sophia prepared the final documents. Daniel had created a digital security network that would make it impossible for the information to disappear. Robert Johnson had activated his legal contacts to ensure protection. Dr. Harris organized the scientific reports that proved the groundbreaking research of Ethan's father. Thomas Clark, the investigative journalist, arrived with explosive information. "We have documented evidence of how pharmaceutical groups have systematically blocked scientific advancements that could cure millions." Ethan looked at everyone. "How do we proceed?" Sophia Miller had the final idea. "A press conference. Let's reveal everything at once. Make the project, the documents, and the evidence of manipulation public." The plan was quickly put together. It would take place in the hospital auditorium, with a live internet broadcast. No media group could censor the information. Hours before the event, Ethan Thompson's phone rang. An unknown voice warned him, "Give up, there's too much at stake." But Ethan was determined. On the day of the revelation, the auditorium was packed. Journalists, scientists, lawyers, all waiting anxiously. Ethan took the stage. Beside him were Sophia, Dr. Harris, and Robert Johnson. Margaret Thompson, though still recovering, watched via the live stream. "Today," he began, "we will reveal a scientific project that could completely change the way we treat genetic diseases." The documents were presented, the evidence of manipulation by pharmaceutical groups, his father's groundbreaking research. The reaction was immediate. On social media, in the news, the story spread like wildfire. Patient advocacy groups began to mobilize. As Ethan spoke, Sophia discreetly held his hand. Something had blossomed between them during this journey, a bond that went beyond the scientific mission. Robert Johnson ensured legal protection. Daniel Wilson monitored the digital fallout. Dr. Harris presented the scientific data. In the days that followed, the scientific world was completely shaken. His father's research gained international recognition. Universities and research institutes wanted to know more. Margaret, now recovered and strong, embraced her son. "I'm proud of you. You've carried on your father's legacy." Sophia then revealed one final secret. "My father, he was friends with your father. They worked together on the original project." A connection no one expected. Ethan looked around at everyone, his mother, Sophia, Daniel, Robert, Dr. Harris. Each of them had been crucial on this journey. "It wasn't about me," he said. "It was about continuing a dream of healing, of helping, of making a difference." The final scene showed them on the hospital rooftop. The sun was setting over New York. A new scientific era was beginning. And at the center of it all, the legacy of a father who never gave up on his dream.